Hello, welcome to Maiden of the Matriarch. My guest today is Thomas Chatterton Williams. He's staff writer at The Atlantic and author of many books, including an upcoming book called Summer of Our Discontent, The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse. We spoke about the so-called woke right, which Thomas wrote a recent article for The Atlantic about, the rejection of liberal principles at both ends of the political spectrum, whether or not we've come to the end of a political golden age during which those liberal principles were honoured by everyone across the political spectrum, what BLM gets right about race in America, what it gets wrong, and why Black culture is now America's most influential cultural export. The extended version of the episode, as always, is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find all of the other stuff associated with the show, the chat community, the writing that I put up on Substack, the bonus episodes I do with my husband, and a reminder as well that the young adult edition of the Case Against the Sexual Revolution was released recently. This is an abridged version of the book for a younger audience, kind of 13 to 16 sort of age range, but obviously dependent on parental judgment. If you know a young person who you think would benefit from reading a shorter, simpler, and less hardcore version of the Case Against the Sexual Revolution, then please think about buying them a copy. Thomas, should we start by talking about this article you wrote for The Atlantic a little while ago, which got a lot of attention, I thought was really interesting, on the woke right? Do you want to? This is a term that's been in circulation online in recent months. What do you mean by the woke right?
Sure. It's not a term that I created, and it was a term that I was initially a bit skeptical of when I heard the British commentator Konstantin Kisin use it, or James Lindsay here in the US. It's a term that had been circulating, and it plays on this pejorative woke, which has been applied to the left for quite some time. And I would say, woke means different things to different people, but what I see it as fundamentally, outside of the initial use of the word that its proponents had about being awakened to injustice and just being a good person, what it really started to symbolize, I think, was an idea that politics is zero sum. It's all about power, and that people can essentially be split into groups of oppressors and oppressed, and that grievances on behalf of the oppressed and victims attain a kind of status and an importance over all normal procedures. And so the basic status quo and the liberal order can be suspended in order to address these wrongs. That had obtained in elite institutions throughout the 2010s, and it really, I think, was impossible to ignore during the pandemic in 2020 and the racial reckoning here in America that even extended over to Europe. And now what I think, these commentators like Konstantin Kisin and James Lindsay were picking up on early, that I think is undeniable now, is that we didn't get a kind of correction back to conservatism when this movement on the woke left exhausted itself. What happened actually is the pendulum swung to a kind of distorted mirror image of this ideology, where the same kind of mood and style of grievance politics won out, but it's just who was a victim and who was an oppressor. Those categories were swapped. So, a kind of white man that J.D. Vance epitomizes from, the forgotten hinterlands of America becomes, Christian straight male who's lost out in, the post-war liberal order of globalization. That's now the victim par excellence. And this person has the right to use a politics of retribution and revenge to suspend all norms and right all wrongs. And so Donald Trump, rides in on this wave. And, I think the term woke, flawed as it is, really captures this, because it's not politics as usual. It has nothing to do with conservatism. Actually, it has much more in common with, horseshoe theory comes into play here. It has much more in common with its antithesis on the left than it does with anything like the center right or the center left of American politics.
Do you know this expression, the woke more correct than the mainstream?
I don't know that.
So this is an expression on the dissident right. I can't remember who originated it, some are non. What it describes is what horseshoe theory looks like from the inside, basically. So the claim is that woke people actually get things right more often than do conservative mainstream people, in that there's a kind of flash of insight that wokeness possesses, which is missed by the mainstream, but which actually people on the the dissident right, the online right, whatever, tend to agree with. Okay, so one example would be that America was founded on racist principles.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously the 1619 Project or whatever would concur, and the dissident right would concur, and that they would say that America was like a racist, explicitly racist project. And then mainstream conservatives would disagree and so say, no, America was founded on universalist principles, right? It's
Yeah,
interesting, isn't it?
it's like racism and anti-racism both posit, white supremacy as the starting point.
Yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah. And well, certainly they both are much more preoccupied with race.
right. No, that's really interesting. There's multiple aspects of wokeness that do have some type of like you called it a flash of insight that I think actually there are kind of hidden systems that govern reality in some ways, and that you can be red pilled on or awakened to. It's the problem becomes when you lose all sense of proportion and you only see the world through a single lens, and then everything has to be in service of correcting all of the world to adhere to this single lens. And that's why both the woke right and the woke left are very concerned with kind of revisionist history. Like 1619 is a kind of revisionist history, but there are parallels, on the woke right with people like, Daryl Cooper and these people going back and trying to revise our understanding of who was good and bad in the Second World War and things like this. Even Vladimir Putin, who's a kind of I don't know if woke right is, if I'm stretching the term too far, but Vladimir Putin at the outset of the invasion of Ukraine gave these kind of incredible justifications when he invoked J.K. Rowling and people like this and said that the West is trying to cancel Russia, a great culture. And, and he wanted to revise history and go back and do a kind of Russian 1619 going back to the year 800. And, it's this kind of impulse to reject, the kind of common understanding of our culture and who we are, and not to try to tweak things at the margins and incrementally improve, but to raise everything down. That's what the impulse of wokeness too is, that it's this, everything must be dismantled. There are different reasons for dismantling things, but the woke left and the woke right agree on dismantling institutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think so. To steal Matt, so someone like Chris Rufo, right, who's not here to speak for himself, and who would I think be a key figure in this work right movement, in that he's very he's not a Burkean conservative, right?
No, he's rather punitive.
Governance.
Punishment is part of it too.
He would say the woke have done a fantastic job of capturing institutions and of affecting their politics with such speed and with such, like, honestly, such impressive political operating, right? He would say, if we are to succeed, we have to imitate their tactics.
Yeah, he does say that. That's exactly what he says. I guess
what's your response?
I deeply disagree, because I think what is most important is protecting the kind of norms and procedures and tolerances of the liberal society. And I think that one of the most important aspects of that is that even in disagreement, one seeks to persuade, one looks for ways to negotiate, to compromise. One acknowledges that, when an opponent wins, it doesn't make the game meaningless or upend our ability to believe that in the future we can, that's how our politics actually is supposed to work. Something happened very darkly in American politics when it became that if the other side cannot win, if they ever get back into power, the whole system is over. We have to prevent them getting back into power by any means necessary. Liberalism rejects that. And I reject even the idea that if Harvard is controlled by the woke mind virus, then that's debatable. I reject the idea that that can't ever be renegotiated. But I think that once you start to upend the way that the institution itself works, then it might not be able to be renegotiated. And when the pendulum swings back, which no one can have a final victory. The society is too big and complex for that. So when the pendulum swings back, you set these terrible precedents. I'm scared of the moment when, a kind of super far left Chris Rufo gets their moment and gets their momentum going. I think that, it's never, these are weapons that can be picked up and used by anybody. And the strength of liberalism is not that it has these overwhelming final victories, but that it keeps the process fair and open for everybody. I think Rufo and his allies have been very, very careless about the kind of norms they've trashed and the precedents that they've set of pure power, dominance. And, I don't think that they can, I might be wrong, but I don't think that they can be dominant forever. So I think that the next people that come in from the left will not be interested in liberal compromise either.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think if there's a defining feature of this era of politics, it's both sides of handling these liberal norms. I suppose one way of viewing it is that actually the liberal norms were always something of an exception in terms of the long political history, and that we might look back at this era and see it as something of a golden age. You know the Monty Python film Life of Brian? I don't know how popular this is outside of Britain.
No, I know these things are extraordinarily popular in Britain,
Right.
I haven't watched it.
So, I mean, it's great. It was made in the 70s. I forget now exactly. And it's like a comedy film it's not actually about the life of Christ. It's about someone who happened to be born in the stable next door to Christ. And it's like, it's a very funny film. But Ed West, who's a friend who's been on this podcast a couple of times, he's observed that the point when it was made in the 70s was kind of the only time it could have been made, because if it had been made any earlier, then the efforts by some Christians to censor the film would have succeeded. And if it had been made any later, there's a famously like transphobic joke in it. That would have seen the film cancelled. But because the 70s was this kind of changing of the guard moment where the old establishment wasn't quite powerful enough, but also the new order hadn't really come in fully, Life of Brian was released. and I wonder whether to some extent what we now see as this age of liberalism and of Burkean conservative principles and respect for institutions and process and so on, which I agree with you, all that stuff is admirable. I wonder if to some extent it was a product of that changing of the guard process, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do see what you mean. And it's very difficult to, I think, I'm a bit older than you. I'm in my 40s. And I think it's very difficult to think that the world that you took for granted for the majority of your life was actually just like this interstitial period between much longer and more normal ways of collective organizing and ways of doing politics, and that everything that you took for granted is in fact not going to last. But I certainly hope that's not the case. But it seems to me that there are many more people than I would have expected who found that way of organizing our lives, the liberal order, the international global liberal order, they found it lacking in some ways and felt that it would be better to throw the whole thing out and try again in some way, and have made it quite clear that they're willing to elect politicians explicitly on that platform. I mean, it's not just America. So one has to wonder, if these larger global trends throughout the West are indicative of some exhaustion with that kind of, status quo that I thought, we're all slaves to our identities and the context in which, the people we're descended from, lived in these societies. My dad, who's old enough to be my grandfather, is an almost 88-year-old black man from segregated Texas who was like fully an adult. It was like your age before civil rights. So I see the kind of liberal order that I grew up in as obviously, nothing but progress. I lived in a different country than my dad was born into. I had opportunities that it seemed to me that I really had a better society, and I assumed my children have a better society. From my vantage point, I couldn't imagine, warts and all, the obvious flaws and all, the lies that we experienced when we were led into war in the Middle East, all of these things notwithstanding, America was a land of ever increasing freedom, tolerance, progress, and the idea of throwing that out because it wasn't working, it really caught me by surprise. But there are many, many of my fellow citizens on the left and the right who really seem to feel that way. It's startling to look up and realize that this centrist kind of position of wanting to do incremental change, but basically accepting that the thing is okay and pretty good, that's not really a majority position right now, and it may not be again.
it might be a majority position among the general public, but it doesn't seem to be among the political elites anymore, which is kind of where it matters. And
Yeah.
I mean, I guess too. So I've stillman Chris Rufo to stillman, like, I don't know, the smartest version of the like radical BLM narrative, right? They would say that actually these liberal principles in America in particular were always fake and were never applied consistently.
That's just a very difficult argument. I've never been comfortable with people, that seems so hyperbolic and exaggerated to me as to lose whatever nugget of truth was in there. Just looking at the kind of issues that are central to Black Lives Matter's, platform, like the very serious problem of, police brutality, disproportionate abuse directed at unarmed Black men in the American population than at other segments of the American population. That is a serious problem. We have numerous documented incidents where the video directly contradicts the official police narrative, and we know that these things have happened, throughout time when there wasn't the ability to record and contradict the police testimony. We've seen this, but at the same time, the numbers are small enough that you would have to be unwilling to accept progress at any cost to say that, this is a society where, some of the expressions that have been used, especially in 2020, when that mood was very hyperbolic, that this is a country in which Black men are hunted down, or this is a country in which there's a genocide against Black men. I mean, people believe that, but it so distorts what's going on and it so overplays the actual problem that part of what I'm arguing in this book is that kind of excess, that type of rhetorical excess, and that kind of demand for perfection and inability to accept, the kind of flawed reality that we inhabit, but to recognize the vast improvements that have been made, that directly leads to a kind of politics of reaction that actually makes the problem of addressing police violence and being sensitive to racial discrepancies, all that, it actually makes that worse. It contradicts the effort to incrementally improve the society, and the backlash actually introduces a kind of racism and an inability to be sensitive to these discrepancies that is much worse than it was 10, 15 years ago.
I think Trump is in the White House in large part because of 2020, right?
100%. And the kind of the false confidence that came out of 2020 as well. There was it was not inevitable that Donald Trump got back into office in November 2024. He had a narrow margin of victory. It was decisive, but it was nothing like an overwhelming mandate. It was as flawed as Joe Biden's candidacy had been, and as flawed as Kamala Harris had been as a kind of vice president that no one had ever chosen or voted for. She nearly squeaked out a victory because Donald Trump was such an uncompelling candidate for all of the reasons that we know about him. But there was a kind of inability to see that this style of top-down forcing people to adhere to a vision of society that a small minority of people believed was virtuous and better, that this was something that, actually created a kind of multicultural, non-elite coalition of voters who wanted to reject it. I mean, one of the most important messages from the Trump victory, I think, was the fact that it was the least racially polarized Republican victory since the Nixon years. So to not be able to understand what's going on in the country and to reduce it to a kind of, implacable white supremacy, I think is to guarantee that you're not going to be able to have a kind of politics from the left that knows how to deal with this.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem as if there's been as much self-examination as you might hope. I mean, the defining slogan of that, the defining slogan of 2024 has to be the Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you, which is superb as a slogan, and really highlights, exactly this, that there was this insane level of overreach.
There was, and that was popular with Black working class men and with Latino men. That wasn't just something that worked on white working class voters. And there's been a kind of reaction that has dismayed me on the left, which has been a kind of doubling down in this and saying that, she abandoned that position. She wasn't like a pro-trans candidate actually, and like real wokeness essentially has never been tried. And like what we need to do going forward is to double down on those kinds of arguments. And I think that that's a recipe for guaranteeing that, the kind of populist movement that Trump rode into office on, the multicultural populist movement, stays in power. Because there is this tone deafness and this idea that, some people know what's best for everybody else and can force everybody else to conform to these visions of society, even if it's really anti-democratic. The thing that was really interesting about these really niche arguments around, not even about trans inclusivity or rights, but about like trans inclusivity in like college sports and things like that, or children's sports, was that it's one of those issues where people are pretty tolerant the less they know about it. But the more that they learn about the issue, it actually turns off all voters. Very few Americans actually want their daughters to compete in sports under these circumstances. And it's just, it strikes me as a very strange issue to wed your national political party to.
Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. I wrote an essay some years ago called Wokeness is Actually Two Things. I've been thinking about it this week, actually, having been in America recently for work. So the two things are, the first is the one that generally attracts more analysis, which is the radically anti-traditionalist, tear it all down, spirit of the 60s, kind of the ideology which comes to dominate the academy and which is mostly popular with white people.
That's true.
Which is, so trans is kind of the purest expression of that. Okay, but there are other expressions of that. It's a general antipathy towards old style Christian conservatism. The other thing that wokeness is, which gets bundled together falsely, is ethnic minority politics. So people who can be simultaneously, I mean, there are many examples of this in Black America, right? People who are simultaneously actually very conservative on transgenderism, same-sex marriage, burning the American flag, like whatever culture war item you want to come up with, but also feel very strongly about their own ethnic interests, whatever those might be. This is also true in Britain, or across the West. This is true that you have this quite fragile coalition between the two types of woke. And one of the things that Trump has done a really good job of is teasing them apart. So
that's very astute.
He induces fury, obviously, in the like white style of wokeness. It's not just white people who are into this, but it is like a primarily white thing. And I think intellectually it's descended from certain styles of Protestantism, probably Quakerism, I think would be the key kind of intellectual thread there. Those people hate Trump, obviously. But actually, as you say, he's done a good job of attracting the support of Black and Latino working class men who might care about Black and Latino issues.
That's a very astute observation, because one of the things that it teases out is it does tease out a racial division. These are overwhelmingly white progressives, but it also that implies this class distinction. The kind of minorities that align with those white progressives are disproportionately highly educated. So they're not representative of Black or Latino populations in general. And in America, I don't know how. You seem very well versed on American politics, but
I have to be.
Blacks traditionally vote Democrat. Like 90% of Blacks, tend to vote Democrat, but that's not because they're the most progressive Americans. It's because for some years now, the Republican Party just became rather inhospitable in their view to their politics, but they are to the right of all other Democrats. They tend to be by far the most conservative Democrats, and a majority of them don't even define themselves as liberals, period. They're either moderate or conservative. And you could imagine that, and Trump is kind of showing this, if you rejiggered the parties a little bit, you would lose quite a lot of black Democrats. Whereas white progressives are the most anti-white members of the Democratic coalition by far over blacks and Latinos. So there's a kind of strange alliance there that can be teased out along education and class lines, and especially can be exploited with wedge issues that have nothing to do with race, but that try to compare certain other marginalized categories to blacks, and that doesn't necessarily feel natural to the black working class. And and immigration is another one of those wedge issues.
Yeah.
Blacks have never, especially the non-elite, have never been in favor of introducing groups that compete with them for scarce jobs and resources in under-resourced communities.
Yeah, and I think the mistake that the Democrats have made, and this is not unique to America by any means, is going in too hard on the white version of wokeness.
Yes, exactly. When most whites still vote Republican, so it was a kind of losing cause.
Yeah, like the fact that Trump won married white women, right? Who in their heart of hearts actually aren't on board with any of this stuff because it's quite fringe. As with most intellectual movements, there's inevitably the smart version and the dumb version. And the smart version of that, Judith Butler, for all of her flaws, is a smart person whose argument is more subtle than she's often given credit for. But the dumb version of it
is deeply unpopular.
Now deeply unpopular and has become more and more obvious.
Yeah.
There's interesting polling as well from the UK that shows that as soon as people learn about transgenderism, they hate it. Basically, like
right.
You just have to rely on them.
It's the opposite of gay rights, right?
Yeah, although I had an interesting conversation for the podcast recently with Daryl E. Paul. He's a sociologist who studied the history of various political movements, including gay rights. And his argument is that it was still basically top-down, the same-sex marriage push, that it was an elite project which gradually won people over, but not, and there's like a version of gay liberation movement which is quite popular. The marriage in the military conservative style has been quite successful, but there's obviously a more radical version as well, which is more closely related to transgenderism and has to be kept a little bit hush-hush in order for the movement to be successful.
Even in the UK as well?
Yeah. I mean, this is to some extent this withered after AIDS crisis, but the anti-assimilation version of gay liberation is... do you ever see these pictures from during AIDS when there were calls to shut down the bathhouses because they were such a vector for disease, and public health authorities were going to step in, and gay men went out on the streets with posters saying literally next step Auschwitz, first the bathhouses, then the gas chambers kind of stuff. Yeah, that version of the politics is obviously like deeply unpopular with the public.
Right. That makes sense. But it does seem to me that the gay movement succeeded on a lot of people saying, oh, actually, like Uncle Bill is, I hadn't thought about that. Like he is. And like, of course I want him to be able to like visit his partner and like have the same like rights when his partner is dying, or to be on the same healthcare plan. And like, why would I just like deny that? And the more they learned about what the movement was fighting for, which was essentially to have access to the same rights, the more that was a compelling position. And then suddenly it was a top-down elite kind of through the courts movement, but also it did gain majority support extraordinarily quickly. But it seems that the more people learn about what's actually going on, especially with the ability for certain biological female spaces to remain intact, that is off-putting to the majority.
Yeah, the white version of wokeness alienates almost everybody except for a fraction of. But then of course it has been so successful, particularly within the academy, which is in itself really interesting. I know it's such like the opposite of a hot take, a cold take, to say that it's religion-like. But one of the things that really interests me about this ideology is that it's so popular among women. It hits like women in their 20s, say, kind of hits them square between the eyes. If they go to university, it's like such an attractive ideology to those people. I find really interesting. And I think it's probably because there are elements of it which are religion-like, obviously, but in such a way that they're specifically attracted to women and much less so to men. There obviously are some men who are really into wokeness, but it's quite rare.
What do you think the aspects of gender are?
So it's partly because it's all about, I mean, you talked at the beginning about the victimhood thing, which is now being borrowed by the right. I think that it really, really strongly appeals to women's urge to be caring towards the vulnerable. And the question is who gets framed as vulnerable? And what the white wokeness has done really successfully is framing certain groups as uniquely vulnerable and then encouraging women to feel compassion towards them. I think that's probably the key thing. And also because it gives your life purpose. If you don't otherwise have any religious commitments, it gives you a life purpose.
Well, yeah, certainly there's the aspect of the kind of cult-like aspect and religious aspect of it, and this kind of God-sized hole in the heart of our secular contemporary culture that asks for purpose that goes beyond just the kind of emptiness of pursuing your professional and academic achievements as an individual, for sure. I also think, I part of what struck me so much in the summer of 2020 was, and I haven't thought about in terms of gender, but just there's the religious aspect, but there's the mimetic aspect that has to do with just the new possibilities that the technology we all use opened up. And, I just don't know that some of this stuff would have happened in the same way if we didn't all live in the same like alternate universe through these devices where we can both perform our values in politics at the same time that we judge each other's values in politics. And so we're perpetually kind of like performing and surveilling and recording and sharing and then mimicking. And we're really being shaped by issues that are not local anymore, but are, I've spent so much time trying to understand why in the summer of 2020, when you had a Uyghur genocide going on, at that time you had over 600,000 Syrians killed or displaced in an extraordinary civil war that had seen the reintroduction of chemical weapons. You had all types of things happening. But at Oxford University, if you weren't up for your final exams because George Floyd died in Minneapolis, you could be excused and didn't have to take your exam. But that was not the case for any other. And I was just trying to understand why. And it's just why on so many levels, why are the Brits even living in this reality? And it can only be possible because of this kind of internet fueled, smartphone driven kind of technological alternate universe that we all cohabit now, that we haven't figured out how to live in. I mean, that's shaping our behaviors across borders. And in some way, George Floyd dying was more real to certain people in France and England and as far as Finland and South Korea than atrocities that happened locally in their own neighborhoods. It's extraordinary. So I think there's the religious aspect, but there's also this kind of like digital mimetic aspect of it that really we haven't figured out how to live with or make sense of yet.
I saw a photo, I guess in the summer of 2020, of a mural of George Floyd in Syria.
In Syria?
Yeah, someone locally had painted this thing, and then it being photographed
they
and
have
shared online.
Quite a lot going on.
You'd think so. I know.
They have a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you also saw photos of like people you mentioned Korea, Japan, going on these protests and holding up signs in English.
In English, and that struck me in I Can't Breathe in Paris. I want to say in Finland, there was a march against white supremacy, and the entire society is Finnish. I don't know. You can get into the weeds about what white is, but it's like one of the most homogeneous societies in the world. So who they're marching against is not clear, and who they're marching on behalf of is not clear. They are all in the same category and not very exposed to non-whites or non-Finns. But that happened after May 25th, 2020. It was just an extraordinary kind of, I guess, some people use the term mass psychosis, but it was really like, I think it was impossible without the preconditions of the pandemic. We're all kind of in this suspended reality that's not our normal day-to-day life where we're going to the office and dealing with myriad pragmatic tasks. But also, I don't think it could happen in the year 2003 when we just watched the nightly news together or something and emailed several times a week, but didn't live in this kind of social media universe.
True. Well, it's notable, isn't it, that the 1992 LA riots did not spread to other parts of the
Internationally?
world. Yeah.
No, no.
Yeah. Whereas now I'm told that if there's a high profile police killing of a black person in America, it leads to black people in Britain having a drop in their support for police in Britain, even though it
Interesting.
has, they're
So
obviously
politics really
different
is
police
not, all
forces.
politics is not local anymore.
Yeah, because people are so online. I mean, similarly, you'll hear kids in Britain talking about like the feds, and they've taken seriously, they've taken this language from, I guess, American TV or American music, maybe more likely.
Well, that's the other thing is like the lingua franca for a long time has been hip hop, like in
Yeah.
France where I live. I mean, it's even more popular than anywhere else. It's the second largest market for hip hop outside the United States. And they use American terms for things that really aren't local to their own
Mm,
society. But, the lingua franca of the social media era is American English. It's the American kind of jargon that comes out of American universities. And so this kind of
mm,
way of talking about social justice, this woke kind of dialect that's extraordinarily American inflected, is the same dialect now that like people in societies that are very far away from America are using to understand their own reality. So the French, have a very different kind of experience coming out of colonialism than America has coming out of chattel slavery within the United States, but they've kind of adopted for a vocabulary to make sense of their own society's hierarchical structuring. They've adopted an American language that really has to do with the Black American experience and certain things that are relevant to American history. They've imposed that framework over their own society, and in some ways it works, but in other ways it's a very poor fit, even on the level
mm,
of like, re-racializing French society to introduce identity politics when they have a very different way of thinking about who's a citizen and what citizenship means and what laicity means. These ways of thinking in a society like America that has always been multi-ethnic don't necessarily fit in Germany or France or continental Europe. And I think the closest fit might be the UK, but still that's a different history. And the United
mm,
Kingdom did not actually have slavery within its borders. I think it always is very different when you're a minority group that comes from former colonies into the metropole than when you're a minority group whose foundational experience is having been brought involuntarily to be slaves within the metropole.
mm,
That is not an analogous experience. And so there have to be different ways of talking and speaking about it. But the American way just dominates. And a lot of that is just because the lingua franca of the digital era is American jargon,
mm,
social justice inflected jargon.
mm, mm. Yeah, so, I mean, some of that is to do with the fact that America's is really big, and
Mm-hmm.
you would expect the largest Anglophone nation to dominate the Anglophone internet
Mm-hmm.
because there are just so many Americans. I think also, though, that Black American culture is in some ways America's greatest export, or
Mm-hmm.
certainly its
Absolutely.
greatest cultural export. I mean, you will go to the middle of the Australian outback. I was watching a documentary recently about Indigenous Australians in Alice Springs, and the the other side of the world, the middle of nowhere, right? You will find young Indigenous Australians who are wearing Nikes and imitating and listening to hip hop and using Black American slang, and you can also hear Black American slang in everywhere from the Philippines to Turkey to everywhere. It's so powerful.
Yep.
It just seems to be this astonishingly mimetic cultural form, and I guess that's partly because people have found ways of applying it to every experience of ethnic marginalization.
I think that's right. Yeah. And there's a low entry point to, it's like a much lower entry point to making your own kind of hip hop culture than like jazz culture had when you had to
Mm,
master instruments and things like this. The digital
mm,
aspect of hip hop, the technological component of hip hop culture is also what makes it spread so easily and to be applied to different like local grievances. Like hip hop is the lingua franca in Palestine. It's
mhm,
it's all over Africa. It's I spent some time when I was writing my first book down in Argentina, and it's all the way at the tip of the world down there. I mean, and it makes sense. It's, it's a way of, it's talking, it's poetry. It's naturally lending itself to a kind of narration of overcoming. And it's also infectious. I've written my first book, Losing My Cool, was about growing up in a Black culture that was very different than my father's Black culture, and kind of meditating on why, when some of the barriers that had been removed from outside of the societal barriers that my father was up against had been removed for some of my friends and me, why we were kind of imposing certain limitations on ourselves, and why we were self-sabotaging in certain ways, and what was so compelling about this kind of oppositional way of conceiving of our own identities that was glamorized and commercialized through the hip hop culture, the kind of real, in the 90s, that kind of real gangster rap culture that was sold to us, and what was going on there. And, even when I was criticizing the kind of content of the form that was being sold to us, and the way that racial authenticity was so confused with a kind of street pose and a street authenticity, I could never not see the form itself. The way the music is made, it was extremely infectious, and had, it was so obvious why that musical form, now it's like the oldest form going. It's like over 50 years old. Why it's dominated for so long is clear, because it really was a kind of musical breakthrough for the contemporary era. But it's interesting that the form itself kind of stays and innovates, but the content can be swapped in from any culture, as you said, where there's a kind of marginalized community that sees itself as the Blacks of its society. And that's kind of really what it is. It's like the Palestinians see themselves as like the Black people. The Arabs in France, in Paris, see themselves as essentially the Blacks of that society. And so you kind of, you imagine yourself into this kind of history. And in a way, like the way that, Black slaves and their descendants in America kind of imagined themselves into Old Testament narratives of Jews in Egypt. It's kind of just like you play the role of the underdog, and it's the kind of it's the culture of the underdog, which is really universally applicable.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.